Hello, these are artificial intelligence-generated voices, but the words read were created solely by humans using artificial intelligence for some of the writing, as well as Microsoft's Clipchamp to generate the voices and the podcast recordings.
Hello, and welcome back to the podcast. I'm Mike Prasad, and today, we are diving into Emergency Support Function ESF number 5. Emergency Management. This is a crucial part of disaster response, and with me as always, is my podcast partner Patricia Frost, the Vice Chair of the National Pediatric Disaster Coalition. Welcome once again to the podcast, Pat.
Thanks, Mike. As you are our podcast and real-world expert in emergency management, I'm excited to dive into this conversation, highlighting the vital role of emergency managers in ensuring the needs of children are identified and planned for in a community's overall emergency management or emergency operations planning.
Emergency management is a multifaceted profession and a management framework that may appear difficult to understand. Sometimes, it is easier to explain what folks like me don't do. We don't run the ER department of a hospital, and I am not your IT guy who gets the computers back up and running after a cyber attack, although both of those roles can certainly benefit from emergency management principles and practices.
Very much like a conductor of a huge symphony of individual stakeholders in the community, or an air traffic controller supporting a huge situation room.
It is a profession rooted in civil defense from the mid-20th century and systems management called the Standardized Emergency Management System, SEMS, also known as the Incident Command System, ICS, which originated as best practices from California's fire service. Emergency management and the role of emergency managers have evolved significantly since Benjamin Franklin, who I personally believe was our nation's first emergency manager, and who you can learn more about in today's podcast notes. When discussing ESF 5, we're looking at the big picture of disaster management, sometimes called declared disasters, the coordination, planning, and information sharing across multiple agencies. So, it has an important role when it comes to including the needs of children in this big picture.
One missed opportunity I have seen is when emergency managers begin to conduct their initial community threat and hazard identification and risk assessment or THIRA, children are routinely left out of the risk demographics. These THIRA assessments are done annually, during what we call blue sky times. I find this ironic because THIRAs are supposed to be designed to identify and help a community understand who are the most vulnerable and where the most likely hazards are in the jurisdiction.
Absolutely. For instance, a community once overlooked a large daycare center during a THIRA. This oversight meant no specific evacuation or shelter plans were in place for over 200 children, leading to chaotic and risky situations during a severe storm. In my experience, if children are not yet routinely factored into these assessments, we risk missing key needs during response and recovery. For example, we might not allocate enough pediatric medical resources or child-specific sheltering options, right?
Right. And it's not just medical resources. Children have different physical and emotional needs in emergencies. If we don't account for them, we may lack the appropriate size of equipment for decontamination or fail to create effective evacuation routes for schools or childcare centers. The good news is the ASPR Region 5 for Kids Pediatric Disaster Center of Excellence has published the very first Pediatric Hazard Vulnerability Assessment, or HVA scorecard for healthcare coalitions focused on the unique needs of children, and is currently working on an online version. They also have infographics that give emergency managers a quick reference on risks to children based on specific hazards. You can find those resources in the podcast notes.
Welcome back. We often plan for adults first, and it can feel like children's needs get lost in the shuffle. I think that's because people don't realize how different their own needs are in an emergency. It's not just about shrinking adult-sized solutions down. Emergency management is about a lot more than just handling or helping resource an immediate crisis. Podcast listeners should note, there is a common acronym in emergency management for the prioritization of what needs to be done, known as LIP-ER. It stands for life safety, incident stabilization, property and asset protection, economic environmental restoration, and long-term recovery. When those priorities do not include the needs of children, a community's outcome suffers.
Exactly. While the responsibility of preparedness for children falls primarily on parents, it is also a shared whole community responsibility. We know that when settings or sites where children gather, such as schools, childcare, and family services, do not have their leadership at the planning table, unintended gaps result. For instance, in a chemical spill or similar incident, adult-sized equipment might not fit children, and adult decontamination procedures might be inappropriate. This can result in kids not being adequately protected, which is the last thing we want. It's too late to make changes in those critical moments if we're unprepared.
Right. In that daycare center case, the community had not accounted for the children attending a large local daycare center, which housed over 200 kids. Because the daycare wasn't included in the risk assessment, the emergency operations plan didn't include an evacuation plan for the center, nor did they have appropriate child-sized medical supplies or enough shelters to accommodate families. When the area was hit by a severe storm, the daycare had to evacuate without clear guidance, causing confusion, delays, and putting those kids at risk. There was a scramble to find kid-friendly buses and safe transportation. The shelters weren't prepared to handle so many young kids with caretakers, which just compounded the problem. And all of that does not even touch upon the massive family reunification work needed once the storm passed.
Yes, and that's the kind of scenario we want to avoid. If the number of children and their ages had been known and understood, there is a greater opportunity to anticipate and plan for children's specific needs by developing proper evacuation and reunification plans, pre-staging supplies, and ensuring shelters were equipped to support families.
That's a perfect example of why we need to get this right from the get-go. Emergency management is all about coordinating, bringing together the right people, resources, and information. Sometimes, I think of it like being Merlin, the wizard from those old stories, working behind the scenes to make everything happen. And it's not just about logistics, which we will cover in ESF number 7. Lessons learned during COVID brought increased attention to the importance of planning for the mental well-being of children, families, first responders, and emergency management staff during the response and post-incident trauma. While most people may experience disasters once or twice in their lifetime, an emergency management job is doing disasters over and over again, so taking care of our own wellness is just as important.
Exactly. And when we plan effectively for children, we strengthen our entire community's resilience. Everyone benefits from more thorough preparation. That is why the ESF 5 of emergency management appears so daunting. It touches all the other 15 ESFs with coordination informed by THYRAS, and is designed to make emergency plans more comprehensive. Because once we have the right demographic and hazard data, we're not just guessing. We can plan for pediatric medical resources, exercises which include unaccompanied minors, specialized evacuation procedures, and even shelters designed with children in mind.
We talk about pediatric assessment in all hazards incident preparedness, response, recovery, and mitigation deliberative planning as the post's text. That's a lot to unpack if you are not in emergency management. I have some help available in a free chapter for and yes, this is a shameless plug, new book which came out in September of 2024. The chapter is called Emergency Management 101, and is designed to help outline all these elements, along with a great set of priorities and other emergency management mantras. And yes, in that free-to-read online or download chapter is a section on the impacts on children and sites where children are most likely found, such as daycare centers, schools, children's hospitals, and more. Podcast listeners and others can go to the notes on this podcast for the link.
What a great way to jumpstart the collaboration with emergency management and pediatric partners, connecting schools, healthcare providers, and childcare centers to help make the community even more resilient.
One more thing about deliberative planning, it's a project management concept which can work outside of emergency management too. FEMA has a course series on deliberative planning. I'm in the last class of that series myself right now, and I used it to help me with the pediatric disaster feeding challenge I am working on fixing in the US, which I am providing a teaser now, for the upcoming next in line episode of this podcast. The one on ESF number 6, Mass Care. Communities can utilize their urban planners and their emergency management teams, including their local emergency planning committee or LEPC, to solve for any problems which crop up in their pediatric assessments. And this can be done through deliberative planning.
Precisely. When children are included, we're not only ensuring their safety, but we're also creating a more effective and coordinated response for everyone. It's about making sure children are visible in every phase. Including children is not an extra step in emergency management. It's an essential one. If we want to protect the most vulnerable members of our community, we must prioritize them in our planning and response efforts.
I could not agree more. Ben Franklin is credited with saying that if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. Maybe it was Winston Churchill instead, or even Confucius. I like to think it was Franklin. I hope this sparks some new conversations about how we can better protect children in disasters.
Those are great words to end on, Mike. And I will take this episode's sign-off. We invite our listeners back next time when Mike and I will be discussing Emergency Support Function, ESF number 6 mass care. Remember to please use #PrEP for the kids when amplifying any of our social media messages. Thank you so much for joining us again today. Goodbye now.
Please visit us on the web at npdcoalition.org. Our vision is to support the development of a unified medical and health emergency management community to prepare, respond, and recover from emergencies and disasters.